What if the most decorated general in American history looked his commander-in-chief directly in the eyes, and simply refused to obey? What if the man who had liberated the Pacific, who had accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, who had rebuilt an entire nation from the ashes of war, decided that the orders coming from Washington were not just wrong, but dangerous, even cowardly? This is not a story about insubordination. This is a story about two completely different visions of power, duty, and the future of the free world, colliding at one of the most volatile moments of the 20th century. It is a story about a five-star general who believed he was above the political calculations of presidents, and a president who believed no soldier, no matter how legendary, could be allowed to operate outside the boundaries of democratic authority. What unfolded between General Douglas MacArthur and President Harry S. Truman in the early months of 1951 was not simply a military dispute. It was a constitutional crisis dressed in the uniform of war, playing out in real time while thousands of young men were dying in the frozen mountains of Korea. If this story already has you gripped, and trust us, it only gets more intense from here, please subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and share this video with someone who loves history. Drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know about this conflict before watching. Your engagement helps us keep bringing these powerful stories to life. To understand why MacArthur refused to accept the limits Truman tried to set, you must travel back to the summer of 1950, when the world was still exhaling from the devastation of World War II and already holding its breath at the growing shadow of communism. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, armed and emboldened by the Soviet Union, crossed the 38th parallel in a thunderous invasion of South Korea. Within days, the situation was catastrophic. The South Korean army was crumbling. The capital city of Seoul fell on June 28, just 3 days after the invasion began. President Truman, a plain-speaking man from Independence, Missouri, who had once been a haberdasher and a World War I artillery officer, made a decision that would define his presidency. He committed American forces under the banner of the United Nations to push back the North Korean aggression. And for the supreme commander of that effort, there was really only one name being seriously considered: Douglas MacArthur, the imperious, theatrical, and militarily brilliant general who had orchestrated some of the most audacious campaigns of the Second World War across the entire Pacific theater. MacArthur was 70 years old in 1950, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed history itself was watching his every move. He had been in the Far East for years, overseeing the occupation of Japan from his headquarters in Tokyo with an authority that some compared more to a viceroy than a military governor. He had transformed Japan, a shattered, humiliated nation, into a functioning democracy with a new constitution, land reforms, and a free press. He was, in many ways, accustomed to operating with near total independence. Washington was far away, both geographically and psychologically, and MacArthur had grown used to making decisions of enormous historical consequence without waiting for approval from politicians he often considered his intellectual inferiors. When Truman appointed him commander of United Nations forces in Korea on July 8, 1950, MacArthur accepted with the quiet certainty of a man who believed the assignment was simply his destiny. The early weeks of the Korean War were humiliating for American forces. The North Koreans pushed the combined UN forces all the way down to a tiny perimeter around the port city of Busan in the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. It was called the Busan Perimeter, and it felt to many like it could become another Dunkirk, a last desperate stand before complete disaster. But MacArthur, with characteristic audacity, devised one of the boldest strategic gambits of the entire Cold War era. On September 15, 1950, he launched Operation Chromite, an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city on the western coast of Korea, behind enemy lines, in waters so treacherous that his own naval commanders had warned him the mission was nearly suicidal. The tides at Incheon were among the most extreme on Earth. The window for a successful landing was measured in minutes, not hours. Military experts had given the operation a 1 in 5,000 chance of success. MacArthur landed anyway, and it worked. It was a masterstroke. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was liberated. By late September, the North Korean army was shattered and retreating in chaos back toward the 38th parallel. And it was at this exact moment, this dizzying peak of triumph, that the seeds of the catastrophic conflict between MacArthur and Truman were quietly planted. The question facing Washington was now profound and loaded with consequences. Should United Nations forces simply restore the pre-war border at the 38th parallel and declare victory? Or should they push north into North Korea itself, and attempt to reunify the entire Korean peninsula under a democratic government? MacArthur argued passionately for the second option. He believed the destruction of the North Korean state was not just militarily possible, it was morally necessary. Truman and his advisors, particularly Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Secretary of Defense George Marshall, were more cautious. They feared that pushing too far north might provoke China, the People's Republic of China, which had itself undergone a communist revolution just 1 year earlier in October 1949, into entering the war. MacArthur dismissed these fears almost contemptuously. He was certain China would not intervene. He was devastatingly, catastrophically wrong. On October 19, 1950, Chinese forces began secretly crossing the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, in massive numbers. By late November, when MacArthur had already publicly declared that the war was essentially over and the troops would be home by Christmas, approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers had secretly entered Korea. On November 25, 1950, they launched a massive offensive that hit the overextended UN forces like a wall of steel and fury. The result was one of the most brutal military reversals in American history. Marines and soldiers at the chosen reservoir fought in temperatures that dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. Units were surrounded, cut off, and forced to fight their way out through human waves of Chinese infantry. MacArthur's home by Christmas offensive collapsed entirely. By January 1951, Seoul had fallen again, this time to Chinese and North Korean forces, in a retreat that shook the confidence of the entire Western world. This is the exact midpoint of one of the most dramatic stories in American military history, and if you're finding it as gripping as we think you are, please take a second right now to subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and share it with a friend or family member who would find this story as fascinating as you do. And leave us a comment. Tell us something you just learned, or what surprises you most about this conflict between two towering historical figures. Your comments genuinely mean everything to us and help this channel grow. In the aftermath of the Chinese intervention and the catastrophic winter retreat, MacArthur's tone shifted from supreme confidence to something that alarmed the Truman administration deeply, a kind of barely concealed fury, bordering on insubordination. MacArthur began making public statements that directly contradicted official United States policy. He wrote letters to politicians. He gave unauthorized interviews. He sent a message to the commander of enemy forces that some officials in Washington interpreted almost as a private negotiation attempt, bypassing the president entirely. Most explosively, on March 20, 1951, when Truman was quietly preparing a diplomatic peace proposal that might end the war at roughly the 38th parallel, a compromise solution, MacArthur publicly undermined it. He issued a statement threatening China with an expansion of the war unless they surrendered, directly torpedoing the carefully constructed diplomatic initiative that Truman's team had been preparing for weeks. This was not a misunderstanding. This was MacArthur telling the world, loudly and deliberately, that his vision for the war would prevail over the president's. The final breach came on April 5, 1951, when Republican House Minority Leader Joseph Martin read aloud on the floor of the United States Congress a letter he had received from MacArthur. In that letter, MacArthur wrote that the Korean War should be escalated, that nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan should be used against communist China, and that there was no substitute for victory. This was a direct, public repudiation of Truman's entire strategic framework. Truman, a man not known for outward theatrics but possessed of an iron core when truly tested, was now facing an undeniable reality. His supreme commander was openly campaigning against the policies of his own government, corresponding with the political opposition, and using his fame and prestige to wage what amounted to a political war against the commander-in-chief from a military headquarters in Tokyo. For Truman, this was no longer a matter of strategic disagreement. It was a constitutional crisis. On April 11, 1951, Harry Truman fired Douglas MacArthur. The announcement came in the early morning hours in Washington, and it detonated across America and the world like a thunderclap. MacArthur had not been warned. He learned of his dismissal not through official military channels but through a news bulletin, a humiliation that many observers believed was partly intentional. The public reaction in the United States was volcanic. Truman's approval ratings plummeted to some of the lowest ever recorded for a sitting president. Furious citizens burned effigies of Truman in the streets. Congress was flooded with letters and telegrams demanding Truman's impeachment. When MacArthur returned to the United States for the first time in 14 years on April 19, 1951, he was greeted by one of the most extraordinary public receptions in the nation's history. In New York City alone, an estimated 7 million people lined the streets to cheer for him, a crowd larger than the celebrations held for the end of World War II. MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress on April 19, 1951, delivering one of the most famous speeches in American political history. He defended his strategy, challenged Truman's judgment, and closed with the haunting line drawn from an old barracks ballad, that old soldiers never die, they simply fade away. The speech was met with thunderous applause and many grown men weeping openly in the galleries. For a moment, it seemed as though public opinion might reverse the decision, that the sheer force of MacArthur's prestige might overwhelm Truman's authority. But the U.S. Senate conducted hearings on the dismissal throughout May and June of 1951, and what emerged was something far more sobering than the legend MacArthur had carefully cultivated. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley, Lawton Collins, Hoyt Vandenberg, Forrest Sherman, all testified that MacArthur's strategy risked expanding the Korean conflict into a full-scale war with China and possibly the Soviet Union. Bradley famously characterized MacArthur's vision as fighting the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. Slowly, the political storm began to subside. History has rendered a verdict that is both clear and deeply instructive. Truman was constitutionally and strategically correct. The principle that civilian authority must always stand above military authority, no matter how brilliant or celebrated the general, is not a bureaucratic formality. It is the very foundation upon which democratic government rests. MacArthur was a military genius of the first order, a man whose courage and vision had shaped the destiny of nations. But he had allowed his genius to become arrogance, his confidence to become insubordination, and his personal convictions to override the authority of the republic he had sworn to serve. The Korean War ended in an armistice on July 27, 1953, 2 years after MacArthur's dismissal, roughly at the same 38th parallel where MacArthur had wanted to push beyond. Truman's cautious, painful restraint had, in the end, prevented what could have been a Third World War. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something about power, duty, and the price of defying democratic authority, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this extraordinary story. And leave us a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most, what you didn't know before today, or who you think history has judged more fairly, Truman or MacArthur. Your voice matters here, and every comment, every like, every share helps us keep telling the stories that shape the world we live in today.